I run a demolition outfit based out of Fort Rich. 3 trucks, 5 men, and a schedule so tight it squeaks. I've made a living taking jobs other crews turn down, usually because they're a mess of red tape, structural nightmares, or 30 years of asbestos behind every wall. Doesn't matter to me. You pay me, I knock it down fast. That's what made the Sierra Vista research base job so tempting. The base had been sitting on the outskirts of the Mojave Desert since the 1960s. It shut down in '92 and no one has touched it since. Local kids dared each other to sneak in, but most folks just steered clear, calling it the heat trap. The county finally got a grant to clear the land and turn it into a solar farm. I didn't care. The contract was county approved, and a $50,000 bonus was offered if we finished before the blistering July deadline. $50 grand for a month's work was enough to keep my crew paid and my personal debt off my back. During our pre-demo walkthrough, I had the blueprints rolled under one arm and a tactical flashlight in the other. Harris, the county rep, walked ahead of me discussing dust abatement maps and load-bearing columns. Most of the base was your standard mid-century concrete block, reinforced steel, and cracked linoleum floors. You could practically smell the desperation in the air. Desperation for discovery, desperation to leave. We reached the sublevel through a narrow service stairwell behind the main server room. That's when I noticed something off. At the far end of the corridor, where the blueprint showed an old generator annex, there was a wall. Not an original wall. This one was newer, with concrete blocks set unevenly and mortar that was sloppy. Someone had sealed the hallway by hand. Blueprint says this leads to Annex C, I told Harris, tapping the page. Looks like it was part of the original design. He didn't even slow down. Yeah, that area got sealed back in the late '90s. No entry records, no inspection forms. County says we're not touching it. Why? I asked. If it's part of the structure, we're supposed to clear it. He shook his head. That's the issue. It's not listed on the active plans. Legally, it's unacknowledged. If we file to unseal it, that opens a chain of delays. Environmental inspections, historical society review, maybe even a federal appeal, given the nature of the research done here. I frowned. How long are we talking? 4 to 6 weeks minimum. The whole project freezes until it's cleared. Your bonus goes up in smoke. We stood there for a moment, both of us looking at the sealed wall. The mortar looked old but brittle. Someone had done it quickly. No signage, no permit tags, just a narrow hallway someone wanted gone. Mark it inaccessible and move on, Harris said, scribbling something on his clipboard. The county is covering its ass. So should you. I nodded and we kept walking, but I didn't stop thinking about that wall. If my crew found it while gutting the substructure, they'd ask questions. That meant someone would call it in, and the whole damn timeline would collapse. I wasn't about to lose my payday over one sealed room that some bureaucrat had forgotten to add to the plans. I figured I'd handle it quietly night after the crew clocked out. No reports, no delays. We started demolition from the top down. Roof sheeting, tiles, plasterboard, and load-bearing elements. My crew worked fast. We always did. But something about Sierra Vista slowed them down, piece by piece. At first it was small things. Tools left in one room ended up in another. Power flickered even with our generators running steadily. One of the guys swore his ladder had shifted on its own while he was on it. I choked it up to nerves and caffeine. Then came the sounds. Footsteps, heavy and dragging, always in the halls we'd already cleared. Hollow echoes that didn't match our movements. One afternoon, Carl radioed me from the West Wing, saying he heard someone whispering through a vent. Swore he could hear his name. I checked it out. The vent was clogged with 30 years of dust and desert detritus. Whatever he'd heard, it wasn't a voice. But the real shift came with Manny. He was one of my best guys. Ex-military. Didn't scare easily. But that morning, I found him standing in the sub-base, staring at the sealed corridor. He wasn't supposed to be there. I called his name twice before he turned to face me. His face was pale, eyes glassy, as if he'd just come out of a fever dream. I'm done, he said. You can mail my check. I frowned. What happened? He silently stepped past me, grabbed his things, and walked straight off site. Before he left, he said one thing, his voice barely a whisper. It doesn't want to go. I didn't ask what it was. I should have, but we were already behind schedule and I couldn't afford to lose another day. I covered Manny's hours myself, hoping he'd come to his senses. All trash, logged loads, didn't sleep more than 4 hours a night. And still, the sealed corridor sat there in my head like a rotten tooth. I started dreaming about it. Always the same thing. One long room, rows of benches facing a whitewashed wall. No windows, no doors. Just me standing at the back watching them. An empty chair, but it wasn't really empty. I could feel something waiting on it just behind the veil. 3 days later, a new county rep showed up. Young guy, sharp haircut, shoes too clean for the site. "How's progress?" he asked, flipping through my reports. "Smooth," I lied. "Right on target." He nodded, made a few notes. Didn't ask about the sealed corridor. I kept it that way. The crew clocked out around 6 o'clock. I stayed behind, made up a story about reviewing reports. The truth was, I didn't want anyone around when I opened the corridor. Too many eyes meant too many questions. If I could just clear the space and log it, I could list it as it was in the blueprints. Box checked. No delays. I wheeled the concrete saw down into the subbase, every step echoing off the stone walls. The temperature dropped the deeper I went. Humidity hung in the air, thick and musty. The corridor stood waiting at the end of the service hallway. I marked the wall with chalk, fitted my respirator, and started cutting. It took longer than I expected. The mortar was thick and industrial grade, sloppily applied but heavy set, like whoever sealed the space hadn't wanted it reopened. But $50,000 was waiting on the other side of a completed demo, and this wall stood in the way. The blocks gave way in chunks. Dust billowed out in hot, chemical-tasting bursts. I smashed through the final layer with a sledgehammer. My flashlight pierced the darkness beyond the hallway. It was pristine. No water damage, no graffiti. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sterile and wrong. The linoleum tiles were uncracked. The paint a faded institutional green. My boots left prints in the dustless floor which made no sense. Everything else in this place had been eaten by time. At the end of the hall stood a single reinforced door. It creaked open under my hand, revealing a narrow space, soft-walled, lined with yellowed cushions. An old steel cot sat in the center, fitted with leather restraints. The mattress was thin, sunken in the middle. A cracked mirror was mounted crookedly above a bolted desk. I caught my reflection in the shattered glass. My face was broken into jagged angles. On the floor beneath the cot, a circle had been carved into the tiles. The cuts were deep and deliberate, each line etched with something sharp. Nails, maybe. The etching was unfamiliar but felt wrong, off balance, like it pulled at something in the back of my mind. I could feel myself lean toward it, like it had its own gravity. A rusted metal chair stood beside the bed. A patient logbook rested on the seat, its leather cover warped with age. I opened it with cautious fingers. The entries were brief and clinical. Most were mundane, but the last page stopped me cold. It was handwritten. Do not remove her. Do not observe her. Do not allow her name to be spoken aloud. I flipped back. Earlier entries had referred to her only as the subject, but in the margins of the logbook's back cover, scratched deep into the leather, was a name. And then I saw it again and again. On the padded wall beside the cot, on the mattress straps, etched into the foam in ragged fingernail grooves. The same name over and over. I didn't speak it, but I read it. And in that moment, the temperature in the room dropped so sharply I could see my breath. The steel cot creaked behind me. I wasn't alone anymore. I backed out of the cell without turning around. I didn't breathe until I was back in the corridor. Then again, when I made it up the basement stairs, I shut off the lights, locked the exterior doors behind me, and didn't stop moving until I was behind the wheel of my truck. My hands trembled on the drive home. I told myself I'd leave it alone for now. Figure out another way to finish the job. The job had to stay on track. That was all that mattered. Before first light, I came back to the site and sealed the entrance. I dragged old plywood sheets from a scrap pile, bolted them over the fresh gap I'd cut the night before, screwed them tight into the concrete frame, then tagged the boards with paint marker. Asbestos, do not remove. Later that morning, I told the crew I'd found some outdated insulation that needed reporting before we continued demolition on that section. City doesn't want the paperwork, I said. They're telling us to wall it off and move on, so we're moving on. Nobody questioned it. But the next day everything went wrong. One of the excavators clipped a gas line that shouldn't have been there. Then the backhoe, idle seconds before, lurched sideways and crushed one of the old support beams. Nobody was hurt, but it set us back by 2 days. The welder, Nate, caught a flashback from his own torch. Equipment failure, second-degree burns. He didn't say a word on the way to the ambulance. Just stared at me, lips trembling. Manny didn't come back either. I kept my mouth shut, told the others it was old wiring, rusted valves, and bad luck. Every job this size had hiccups. I just needed them to keep working. That night, I reviewed the security from the demo yard. One of the perimeter sensors had malfunctioned during the equipment failures. I scrubbed through the logs. Around 2:07 a.m., the infrared sensor picked up movement. Something moving the length of the fence. Slow, steady, never stopping. It passed beneath the floodlights. No body heat signature. No footprints left in the gravel. I didn't sleep that night. At home, I heard the name, the one scratched into the mattress, the walls, the log cover, whispered through heating vents. The voice wasn't mine, wasn't male, wasn't human. The fifth accident ended it. Reggie, one of the oldest on the crew, dropped a steel support bracket from a second-story scaffold, said his hand seized up mid-swing. When I held him down, I saw the swelling already forming around his wrist, bones out of place. He was shaking. "It wasn't me," he muttered. "Something grabbed me. I swear to God." That was the last straw. They packed up and left before lunch. I didn't try to stop them. By that point, the job was nearly done. The southern wing was already leveled. The rest of the upper floors had been gutted and stripped to code. We just needed to bring down the basement shell and clear the debris. 2 days of work, maybe 3. That was all that stood between me and the bonus. The inspection was scheduled for Monday morning. I wasn't going to let that happen. The truth was simple. I needed the payout. My own truck was 3 months behind on payments. My wife had taken our daughter to stay with her sisters after the last layoff. If this job fell through, I didn't have a next one lined up. So I came back that night with gloves, floodlights, and a crowbar. I just wanted to finish what I'd started. The plywood barrier was still in place over the sealed corridor. I pried off the boards one by one and stacked them neatly against the wall, telling myself it was just another hallway. I kept my eyes down, focused on the floor, and walked slowly down the slope into the untouched wing. The air shifted as soon as I crossed the threshold. Heavy, no dust, still smelled of antiseptic and something sweeter underneath, like spoiled fruit. The crying started while I was checking the junction pipes near the boiler panel. It was faint at first, so soft I thought it might be water in the walls. But then I heard the breath between sobs, a wet, rasping inhale. A woman's voice, broken and rhythmic, repeating something I couldn't quite understand. A lullaby with no tune. I followed it. Each door I passed was open just a crack. I kept glancing in, expecting to find someone inside, but every room was empty. Old beds, restraints on the wall hooks, and cabinets bolted shut. Then I reached the padded room. The crying stopped. I froze in the center of the corridor, surrounded by doors that had quietly clicked shut behind me. The padded room was just ahead. I tilted toward it, careful not to make a sound. It looked the same as before, empty, cot untouched, restraints neatly folded, no visible change, but something in the air had thickened. It pressed against my skin in a way that made my pulse skip a beat. I stepped inside. The mirror was cracked again. A fresh line through the glass, spiderwebbing out from the center. Beneath it, the old circle scratched into the floor seemed more faded than I recalled, like someone had been working at it. But there was no one here. No body, no footprints in the dustless room, no source of the crying. Still, I could feel her. Not see, not hear, but feel. The room wasn't empty anymore. Something stood just beyond my focus, behind the veil of what my eyes could comprehend. I backed out of the doorway one step at a time. Didn't turn around, didn't speak. The crying didn't return, but the silence was worse. I scoped out what needed to be done for demolition. But as I left, the hallway was different, longer, narrower. The angles had warped somehow. Every step felt wrong, like the building had shifted when no one was looking. I found the room again, but the door wasn't the same anymore. Wider, open just a crack, waiting for me. The steel cot was empty, restraints gone. The circle in the floor had been scraped almost completely away. I could hear her now, not beside me but inside the space, breathing in rhythm with mine, close enough that the air stirred when I moved. It hit me suddenly and stupidly. Her name. It had been carved everywhere for a reason. Not to draw her out, to bury her. I remembered old stories. Demon names, binding rites, exorcisms. Speak the name and the thing loses its power. I stood at the edge of the circle and whispered it, once then again. The silence pulled back from the corners of the room. And she answered, not in words, not even sound, but in pressure, in presence. Something stepped into the room that hadn't fully existed before. The cot groaned under unseen weight. The restraints snapped tight without hands. The mirror uncracked itself with a low pop. And for a split second, my reflection wasn't alone. A second face stood behind mine, pale, incomplete. I stumbled back, gasping. I thought I'd been clever. I thought knowing her name gave me power. But as I stepped out into the hallway and the door clicked softly shut behind me, I realized it had never been about power. It was about permission. I woke on a stretcher, sunlight bleeding through the clouds overhead. The sky was too bright. Voices moved around me in snippets, dulled and distant. An EMT explained they found the subbase corridor sealed shut. The whole damn passage had folded in on itself. Freak structural failure. If you'd stayed in there much longer. I didn't argue. They kept me overnight. The next morning I was released. I turned my phone on in the parking lot. A voicemail from the county rep said not to worry about the bonus. They'd extend the project deadline, and a new crew would finish the remaining teardown at their expense as compensation. I went home and slept for nearly 2 days, dreamless, empty sleep. Then I got the update email. Cleanup successful. Site declared safe. Photos of the cleared corridor and cell attached. I clicked through the images. The hallway was gone. The padded cell was demolished. No name marked on any of the objects anymore. The circle of markings was almost entirely erased from the floor. The new demolition crews had gone in, seen old damage, and cleared it. No delays, no reports of equipment failure or personnel incidents. The job was on schedule. The bonus was mine. I actually laughed. It hadn't been real. It couldn't have been. Stress, sleep deprivation, and too much time in a building full of bad history. That should have been the end of it. But that night, sitting at my kitchen table, I opened the photos again, scrolling through slowly, stopping on one, the cell shot from the hallway. I zoomed in on the mirror. Nothing was there. Tension was building. I felt like I was in the hallway again. The pressure of the room weighing on me. I lifted my head, ready to feel normal. Yet the relief never came. My kitchen was darker than I remembered. Colder. Chills trickled through me. No one else was in the room. Nothing moved. But the silence had changed. Thick now, a waiting kind of quiet. I closed the laptop, staring at the wall for a long time. Maybe the new crew didn't find her because she wasn't there. Maybe she came with me. The whispers started a week later. Not outside the door, not through the vents, but right in my apartment. They were soft, hesitant, always just outside the range of hearing. A sound like someone trying to use a voice they hadn't used in decades. I stopped talking. Not deliberately, but I found myself answering calls with only grunts, nodding instead of speaking, and communicating with my wife, Martha, in short, functional sentences. I was listening for the whispers, trying to catch them, to name them, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Martha noticed. "Mark, you're not yourself," she said one evening, watching me across the dinner table. "You're quiet. You look right through me. Are you still thinking about that job?" I wanted to tell her about the heat signature, the cracked mirror, the name. I wanted to tell her that I thought I had brought a ghost home with me. But the thought felt absurd, too large, too insane for the cozy reality of our apartment. "Just tired," I mumbled, pushing my plate away. The stress of the job finishing. It was a messy sight. She sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "We're taking Sarah to see her sister next week. Why don't you come? Get away from Fort Rich for a while." I shook my head instantly. I couldn't leave. The whisper would follow. And if I left, if I didn't watch it, the thing I brought back might do something worse while I was gone. "I need to stay here," I said. "I have to finalize the payment from the county." A lie, but a necessary one. The night Martha and my daughter, Sarah, left, the silence in the apartment deepened. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, surrounded by floodlights I had bought, aimed at every corner, trying to banish the shadows. The whispers got bolder. They weren't just in the walls. They were in the electrical wiring, the running water, the air moving through the window screens. I started to hear the name. Not loud, but a persistent, maddening repetition of the name scratched into the logbook. I stood up and covered my ears, shaking my head. "Stop it," I whispered. "You're not real." The only response was a new sound. A scratching. Not dry and faint like in the sub-bass, but wet and vigorous. It was coming from the floorboards beneath the kitchen table. I flipped the table over, grabbed a pry bar, and tore up the rug. I jammed the bar into the seam between the floorboards and pulled. The wood snapped. I stared down into the crawlspace beneath the house, the beam of my flashlight cutting through 30 years of dust and cobwebs. The scratching stopped. I found the source of the noise, a single, smooth river stone resting on the joist. It was perfectly round, warm to the touch, and carved into its surface was a circle. A circle that pulsed with the same vertigo-inducing pull I had felt in the abandoned cell. I had found the remnant, the anchor, the thing that came with me. The river stone was warm, almost pulsing, against the synthetic chill of the flashlight beam. The carved circle was deep, precise, not just etched but worn, as if by something that had spent centuries drawing the same symbol. I knew instantly this was no ordinary rock. This was the focus point, the anchor that tethered the entity to my reality. I dropped the stone instantly. The sound it made hitting the joist was not a clatter, but a dense, sickening thud. The air in the apartment felt thin. The whispers ceased, replaced by a low humming pressure that filled my eardrums. It was the same feeling of unseen weight I'd experienced in the padded cell, a presence standing just beyond my line of sight. I had to destroy it. I grabbed the sledgehammer I kept in the shed, returned and looked at the stone. It lay there, innocent and deadly, resting on the exposed wood joist. I raised the hammer, aiming for a crushing blow. But as the heavy steel head began its arc, the kitchen lights exploded. The sudden darkness was absolute, broken only by the flashlight beam I dropped in shock. Simultaneously, the low pressure snapped into a focused, intense pain behind my eyes. I felt a sharp metallic tang in my mouth. Don't. The thought wasn't mine. It was cold, deep, and utterly devoid of emotion, delivered with the force of a command. I stopped, the sledgehammer raised over my head. My muscles seized. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, locked in a moment of pure, blinding fear. I heard the wet, rhythmic scratching again. But this time it wasn't coming from the floor. It was coming from the walls, moving around the room, circling me. The air grew thick with that sweet antiseptic smell of the forgotten cell. I managed a single, agonizing whisper, her name. The paralysis broke just enough for me to lower the hammer. The scratching intensified, moving closer to the hole in the floor. I looked down. The flashlight beam, which had rolled near the hole, revealed the river stone wasn't alone. A thin, gray tendril, slick and wet, was slowly unfurling from the darkness of the crawlspace, reaching toward the carved stone. It looked like a fungal root that had been submerged in brine, too pale, too long. I snapped back to motion, driven by a surge of pure terror. I kicked the hammer toward the hole, hoping to knock the stone away, but the tendril was faster. It wrapped around the stone, and with a silent, sickening hiss, retracted back into the darkness. The scratching stopped. The pressure eased. The river stone, the anchor, was gone. I was alone again, left with shattered light bulbs, torn floorboards, and the chilling certainty that the entity was no longer anchored to a specific location. It was anchored to the house, or worse, to me. The next morning, I taped up the hole in the floor, patched the electrical panel, and started packing. There was no point in staying. The anchor was gone, but the entity had retreated, not disappeared. It was using the house as a base camp. I could still feel the cold, heavy silence in the rooms, the phantom itch of the whispers at the edge of my hearing. I called Martha. "I'm coming to join you and Sarah," I said, my voice forced. "The job is finalized. I'm leaving Fort Rich today." She sounded relieved. "That's wonderful, Mark. We've missed you. Just drive safe." I threw everything I owned into the truck. Tools, clothes, my meager savings, all packed and secured. But as I pulled the truck out of the driveway, I noticed something new. The mailbox. It was tilted slightly, the red flag sticking straight up. It wasn't just bent. The pole was snapped clean at the base, resting haphazardly in the gravel. "It doesn't want you to leave." I ignored it. I drove for 3 hours until I was well out of the Mojave and into the high desert plains. I stopped at a roadside diner for coffee. I felt the first wave of relaxation hit me. The physical distance from Fort Rich was a real, calming thing. The diner was busy. I ordered a sandwich and watched the world outside. Then I looked down at the paper napkin on the counter. Printed in the center of the napkin, using what looked like dried ink, was a perfectly formed circle, identical to the one carved into the river stone. I froze. I hadn't drawn it. The waitresses were too busy, the napkin was new. I looked at the salt shaker, the sugar packet, the ketchup bottle. Everything was normal. But the circle was there. The anchor had simply transferred its focus to the simplest, most available object. I was no longer fleeing a place. I was fleeing a pattern. I snatched the napkin, crumpled it into a tight ball, and stuffed it into my jeans pocket. I paid for the coffee, leaving the sandwich untouched, and bolted back to the truck. I spent the next 2 days driving, covering 3 states. I avoided hotels, sleeping in the truck cab at rest stops, constantly checking my surroundings. The transference was relentless. On my gas cap, on the mirror of a vending machine, etched into the dust on the truck's dashboard. Everywhere I stopped, the circle appeared. By the time I reached Martha's sister's house, I was a wreck. I looked like a vagrant, unshaven, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. Martha ran out and hugged me, but she pulled back almost immediately. "Mark, you're shaking. What's wrong?" "I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just a long drive." As I stepped inside, my daughter, Sarah, rushed up to me, holding something tight in her hand. "Daddy, look what I found." She held up a small, smooth, gray stone, the kind you find in a riverbed. It was warm to the touch, and carved into its surface, deep and deliberate, was the circle. The original anchor hadn't been destroyed. It had traveled, waited, and found its way to the only person I loved more than money. It was right back where it belonged. The moment I saw the stone in my daughter's hand, the quiet returned. Not the soft, background silence of the house, but the oppressive, heavy silence of the padded cell. It was a pressure that blocked all thought except one: containment. "Where did you get that, sweetie?" I asked, my voice a forced monotone. "In the yard," she said, looking confused by my rigid posture. "It was just sitting under the bird feeder." I took the stone. It was exactly the same. The same gray color, the same warmth, the same vertigo-inducing circle. It hadn't been destroyed. It had just been transported, finding the fastest path to the object of my deepest concern, my daughter. I walked straight to the kitchen sink, running the water full blast to drown out the sudden, intense whispering that flooded my mind. I wrapped the stone in 3 layers of aluminum foil, then placed it inside a coffee tin, sealing the lid tight. I needed to isolate it. Martha followed me, her face pale. "Mark, what in God's name is wrong? What are you hiding?" "Nothing," I lied, my voice tight. "It's just an old souvenir from the job. I don't want anyone touching it." She looked at the coffee tin, then at my shaking hands. "You're scaring me. Tell me the truth." I couldn't tell her that I had brought a piece of a forgotten asylum home with me, that a disembodied entity was using a river stone to tether itself to our lives. I just shook my head. That night, I sat up, my flashlight aimed at the coffee tin, which sat on the highest shelf in the garage. I didn't sleep. I just watched. The next morning, I woke up slumped over the workbench. The garage was silent. The coffee tin was exactly where I left it. I opened the tin. The stone was gone. No signs of entry. No rattling. The garage was locked. The tin was tightly sealed. The sheer impossibility of it broke something inside me. The entity wasn't just anchored by the stone, it was moving the stone. It was physically manifesting its influence. The whispers began again, louder now, sounding pleased. They were coming from the house, from the heating ducts, the floorboards, the attic crawlspace. It had moved the anchor inside. It was here, in the home of Martha's sister. I found the stone 10 minutes later, resting on the kitchen counter, next to the coffee maker. But it wasn't the same. The single, simple circle was now surrounded by 4 smaller lines, extending outwards, like the spokes of a wheel. The etching was getting more complex. I grabbed it and sprinted out the back door, running into the garden. I jammed a shovel into the earth and buried the stone 6 feet down, marking the spot with a massive cinder block. "You can't move through this." As I stood up, exhausted, I noticed the windows of the house. Sarah, my daughter, was standing at the upstairs window watching me. She was holding a drawing pad and a crayon, and she was etching the circle onto the glass. I ran inside, my mind racing. Sarah wasn't just drawing, she was copying the pattern. The entity was influencing her, using her as a bridge. "Sarah," I shouted, sprinting up the stairs. She looked at me, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with that same vacant, glassy look Manny had had when he walked off the job. She was mesmerized. I grabbed the drawing pad. The crayon had etched a perfect, deep circle onto the glass, surrounded by the 4 smaller lines. "What are you doing?" Martha appeared in the doorway, her voice sharp with panic. "It's the stone," I said, holding up the drawing. "It's using the pattern. We have to break the pattern." I grabbed a towel and scrubbed the window, rubbing the crayon mark away until the glass was clean. The glassy look in Sarah's eyes faded slightly, replaced by confusion. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing, sweetie. Just a bad drawing." I turned to Martha. "We have to leave. No. We have to get away from the house. We have to destroy that stone." Martha looked at the broken floorboards, the scratched logs, the terror in my eyes. The skepticism was finally gone, replaced by terrified resolve. "Fine. We leave. Where are we going?" "Back to Fort Rich. Back to the source. It started at the base, we have to end it there." We packed the car in 15 minutes, telling Martha's sister we had an emergency and had to leave immediately. I placed the shovel in the back of the truck, next to the cinder block. I was going to dig up that stone and destroy it. I drove back to the spot in the garden. I jammed the shovel into the earth, digging furiously. The ground gave way easily. I hit the cinder block. I lifted it out and looked into the hole. The stone was gone. The original anchor was gone. But it didn't matter. The pattern was in the air now. It was in my daughter's mind. We got in the car and drove, speeding out of the suburb, back onto the highway, racing toward the Mojave. I had a new, terrifying certainty. The entity didn't need the stone anymore. It had transferred the full pattern, the full presence, into the mind of my daughter. I glanced in the rearview mirror. Sarah was asleep, but her finger was slowly tracing a shape on the dusty window glass. A perfect circle. We reached the outskirts of Fort Rich 2 days later. The desert heat hit us hard. I drove straight for the old Sierra Vista research base. The gate was locked. I grabbed the bolt cutters and cut the chain. I drove the truck straight onto the abandoned base property. The structures were gone. The land was leveled, cleared for the solar farm. But in the center of the site, where the main administration building once stood, was a massive dark circle of undisturbed earth, the source point. I pulled Sarah out of the car. She was docile, silent, her eyes reflecting the endless blue of the sky. "It started here," I whispered. "We ended here." I had only one weapon left, the power of forgetting. The entity was sustained by memory, by the pattern of its name and its image. It survived because people feared it, reported it, and tried to contain it. I dug a shallow hole in the center of the dark earth. Then I turned to Sarah. "Look at me," I commanded. "Look at me and forget the circle. Forget the name. Forget the whisper." I spoke the name I had found scratched into the logbook, the name I had carried in my mind for weeks. I spoke it once, loud and clear. The effect was instantaneous. The air grew heavy. The darkness pooled at the edge of the circle. The entity manifested, a terrifying presence standing on the periphery of the light, drawn by the sound of its name being uttered at the source. I looked at it. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply focused all my will on erasing the memory. I closed my eyes and imagined the demolition crews, the final, perfect leveling of the structure. I imagined the county rep scribbling on his clipboard, "Unacknowledged, unrecorded, box checked." I turned to Sarah and whispered, "Forget this place. Forget the name." I opened my eyes. The pressure eased. The darkness receded. The entity was gone. Not destroyed, but forgotten. Denied the memory and the focus needed for its existence. We drove away. We never spoke of Fort Rich, the research base, or the whispering again. The memory was erased, categorized as stress-related trauma that disappeared with time. But I know the truth. I know that forgetting is the only true power. And sometimes when Sarah sits at the kitchen table, she draws. Not the perfect circle, but a perfect, straight, unbroken line. A perimeter. A boundary. A silent promise to herself and to the void. She doesn't remember the name, but she remembers the pattern. And that, I know, is how the new silence will keep us safe.